Registration is now open for the 2024 Colson Center National Conference, coming to Arlington, Texas, May 30th through June 2nd at the brand new Lowe's Hotel and Resort. At the Colson Center, we believe every Christian can live like one, but it's hard to know how to do that when the world around us is changing faster than we can keep up with. To help us navigate our cultural moment, this year's conference will dive into the theme of courageous faith. Gifted speakers like Sean McDowell, Neil Shenvi, Kathy Cook, and more will help us tackle the complex worldview challenges of today with biblical insight and practical application. We'll be refreshed, informed, and equipped to live with courageous faith in our unique contexts, callings, and vocations. To register at our lowest price, go to colsonconference.org today. Welcome to Upstream, where we make your worldview bigger and older by taking hard questions to the headsprings of Christian wisdom. I'm Shane Morris. Recently, we marked the 60th anniversary of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s I Have a Dream speech. In that speech, Dr. King laid out a vision for America in which our greatest historical injustice, racism, and oppression against people of African descent would give way to a society that judged people fairly, not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. In Dr. King's vision, this wouldn't be accomplished through stoking racial conflict and dividing people, but by uniting them. And he urged the good of this vision by appealing to America's deepest ideals: equality before the law, our common creator, and the language and storyline of the Bible itself. Well, today, despite massive and undeniable progress toward real justice, Dr. King's vision of the promised land of unity we seek seems to have receded, replaced by a growing variety of ideologies that separate people and place them in perpetual conflict, not according to their characters, but according to features like the color of their skin. And ironically, these ideologies are perpetuated most enthusiastically by those who view themselves as heirs of the civil rights movement. What happened? How did it happen? In what ways have we taken a wrong turn? And how can Christians respond without creating a mistaken ideology of our own, one that leads not toward biblically sound justice and love of neighbor, but more forms of injustice and confusion? To answer these questions, I welcome a pair of authors who've produced one of the most thorough and careful books on this subject so far. Neil Shenvi, PhD in theoretical chemistry, and Pat Sawyer, PhD in educational studies and cultural studies, have long taken an interest in critical theories and the ongoing debate over race and oppression. Their book is called Critical Dilemma: The Rise of Critical Theories and Social Justice Ideologies, Implications for the Church and Society. We'll talk about the book as a whole, but zoom in especially on Chapter 7, in which they explain the ways critical social theories say true things about the world, and how Christians can accept those insights without going woke. Drs. Shenvi and Sawyer, welcome to Upstream.
Thanks so much, Shane.
Happy to be here.
Well, I'm sure you get asked this question a lot, and I think you answer it in the book, but background in theoretical chemistry and background in educational studies, how did men of those educational backgrounds get into the topic of critical social theories?
Providentially. So I began my Christian life as an apologist. I guess I still am. My book, Why Believe, came out last year with Crossway, and it deals with the classic questions: does God exist? Is it the Christian God? Did Jesus rise from the dead? Things like that. And I was interested in talking to my colleagues who are atheists, agnostics, fellow scientists about the gospel. But about 7 or 8 years ago, around the time of Black Lives Matter, I began noticing a shift in the discussion from is Christianity true to the question, is it on the side of the oppressed? And I couldn't understand what was happening. And I saw these ideas seeping into the church. And around that time, I met Dr. Pat Sawyer, my friend Pat, through a mutual friend. And he sort of guided my reasoning and thinking about these ideologies from the perspective of what I now know is critical social theory. And so that began the beginning of a long and beautiful friendship.
For me, my career was in banking and financial services, Shane, and along the way, I was doing apologetics, lay apologetics. And at a certain point, God began pressing me to get more and more into the arena of ideas, maybe officially. And so I went to grad school, got a master's in communication studies, and then a PhD in educational studies and cultural studies. And my master's to an extent, but definitely my PhD program is steeped in the critical tradition. And my dissertation is about social justice and higher education in the age of neoliberalism. And in my dissertation, My conceptual framework starts with critical theory, then it builds with critical pedagogy, then cultural foundations. And so that's why this topic became very important to me. And then I began to see certain things in the larger church. And then, by the providence of God, Neil and I met through a mutual friend, and here we are.
Well, both of you have a background in apologetics, which strikes me as interesting and perhaps key here, because if what you said a moment ago is true, Neil, that the question we ask about justice has really changed, or about the gospel even has really changed, that we're not asking, is this true? Is Christianity true and defensible? So much as, does it solve the injustices of the world? There is this emphasis on justice in the younger generations. Do you feel like that link created an apologetic crisis that you're kind of trying to answer here? In other words, was the perception of injustice a barrier for belief in the people you spoke with?
It was, and actually we talk about it in the book, how we both witnessed people we knew personally as well as public figures who began expressing a concern about social justice, but then their theology got more and more and more progressive and heterodox. And for a long time, I could not figure out why. But through reading critical social theory, through talking to Pat, I began to connect the dots. And we began to see that this claim that we're witnessing the emergence of a new religion, a new worldview, became more and more self-evident to us, at least to me. Probably Pat was way ahead of me. And yeah, I see that as a concern, especially for young people, that they are just steeped in this worldview, or the pseudo-religion of social justice. And because of that, Christianity strikes them not just as false, but as evil and oppressive. So we have to get to the root of why they think that way.
What was your experience, Pat?
Well, it certainly was similar. In my PhD life, the critical tradition was everywhere. And it was also a lens that a lot of my colleagues, my fellow students were, looking at life. And in terms of how they were judging how to think about truth, how to think about knowledge, how they were judging how to think about what it means to be a human being, then also trying to understand their phenomenology, their day-to-day lived experience. And while they weren't necessarily automatically being conscious of the fact that they're putting on this lens, some were very overt about it, but others were just kind of adopting what was in the water, so to speak. I also began to see in the church certain places where the notion of ethnic or racial identity was becoming very prominent in terms of how people were seeing themselves. And it was becoming almost an ultimate identity marker. And that concerned me as a believer, recognizing that our identity in Christ has to be number one, and all these other factors that are important and that matter to some extent certainly are way secondary to our identity in Christ. And that was alarming to me as well. And I began to pray about, should I address these subjects in a more specific way in terms of what I might be doing with my life? And that's partly why we're here.
Books like this always strike me as such, important and well-researched and crucial introductions or explanations of weird social debates that we've gotten into. So, I mean, I want to give place to or acknowledge this sense of vertigo that many of my listeners will have, that just so many Christians in this country, that something tectonic has shifted under their feet in just the last few years, to where vocabularies they don't recognize, and ideologies that are unfamiliar, and categories that just don't compute or don't map onto what they learned in their younger years are suddenly front and center. It's like somebody opened the laboratory of some academic department and out spilled all these crazy creatures that that have been created there, and now they're the cause of all of our debates. This, I think of Carl Trueman's Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self, which is one attempt to explain a good bit of this on the front of sexuality and selfhood. And your book is an attempt to explain, it seems like, the whole vocabulary family and the concept family that emerged in the justice area, in the racism area, in these things we call critical theories, right? And you hear terms thrown around like cultural Marxism and intersectionality and all this kind of stuff. I guess my question is, how do we begin as Christians to learn these stories in a way that's going to be helpful without getting just overwhelmed? Because there's a lot here, and it has a very long history.
We tried to have a framework in the book that helps you connect the dots, like I said. So Carl's book focuses on just sexuality and gender and identity. as a narrow focus. And actually, he wrote the foreword to our book, our current book. And we try to show how those narrow fields are connected seamlessly to issues of race and class and physical ability and education and economy. So all of those are connected through what we now know is an intersectional framework. And we go through the history of these ideas, starting with Karl Marx, going through the Frankfurt School, and continuing to critical race theory and queer theory today. But as we try to show, there's an overarching narrative that's developing around race, class, and gender that's really been prevalent and predominant in the academy for the last 20 or 30 years and is now, I would argue, regnant in our culture as well. So yeah, you can't escape these ideas, but you can recognize them. And once you do, I had a professor at NC State, after I gave one of my talks, he said, once you see it, you can't unsee it. It is everywhere. So we're trying to help Christians have a more solid framework for understanding where all of these ideas related to race, class, gender, and sexuality come from.
So what is that overarching framework? And if you can, contrast it with the vision that Dr. King was painting back in the 60s, because I think most of my listeners will perceive a basic level conflict between those two visions. Like something has changed since the I Have a Dream speech.
Well, I would mention that critical theory, Shane, principally is about power, how power is manifested in society, who hasn't, who doesn't, and why. And it is approaching power from the standpoint of certain axes in terms of how we might think about power being unfolded in society. And those demographic markers, if you will, are things like race and gender, issues around class, issues around whether one is able-bodied or whether they are differently abled, gender, sexual choice, sexual orientation, all these different axes and intersections in terms of determining how power is manifested in society, and then also how power ought to be manifested. And critical social theory is interested in emancipating and empowering those who have been disenfranchised and left out of the status quo based on those intersectional categories. Well, Dr. King was much more interested in the content of character, and that phrase can be weaponized at times to overstate certain things and to not be sensitive about these other intersectional categories that do, and particularly historically, have caused some deficits in power. But King's charge was not principally thinking about those different intersectional categories in terms of how someone should be perceived in society and reified in society. And that is part of the difference. Obviously, King was sensitive to the racism and the racial issues that were surrounding him. That's what his campaign was about. But he ultimately was looking to something higher, and we would argue, in terms of how to think about human beings getting along and connecting with each other and living in unity and harmony with one another. That campaign is not realized in critical social theory. In fact, critical social theory, and many theorists are very overt about this, are pro-identity politics. They're for identity politics. Robin DiAngelo, for instance, who has helped really create what we think about critical social justice in our culture, she's very overt about that and stating very plainly that she's pro-identity politics. That's not the same sense that we get from Dr. King. It's not that he was totally outside of that and not interested in some of that in terms of how it might empower Blacks, but it is a different approach and one that's fundamentally different.
I wonder if we were to ask, Dr. King, what is your end goal? Or the other luminaries of the civil rights movement? What is the thing that you are hoping for? If you got every wish that you have for this nation, what would that look like? And I think he kind of sketches that out in the I Have a Dream speech itself. There's this vision of a society where Black children and white children live together, where there's equal justice under the law, where people are, like you said, judged by who they are and what they do and not how they look. And that's an essential component of that vision of justice. And then, of course, he draws on the Exodus narrative and everything. It's this vision of unity, of wounds healed, of divisions bridged. If you asked a staunch proponent of some of these critical theories today, right? The power dynamics, the person who looks at every little interaction and says, that's somebody trying to gain power over someone else. If you ask them, what is it that you hope for society? Like, what's your vision of a good and just society? What would that person say?
They would probably say they also want justice, But one of the key differences between Dr. King's vision and the vision of critical social theory is whether it's grounded in a sort of Christian narrative or framework. So King, following on the footsteps of people like Augustine and Aquinas, had a definition of justice that was rooted in who God is and God's character in this grand narrative of creation, fall, and redemption. And we actually quote Jonathan Haidt talking about a politics of unity, seeing a fundamental unity between blacks, whites, men, women, Asians, Hispanics, that we're all made in God's image. So that always undergirded King's activism. In contrast, critical social theory does not view things remotely in terms of an absolute sovereign God who created the world, who created us equal and in dignity, from whom we rebel, against whom we've rebelled, and then who is reuniting us in Christ. They do not have that framework. And because of that, if you ask them, do you want unity? They will often problematize unity as a disguise for white supremacy. You claim to want harmony and unity. That's a way for you to continue to perpetuate injustice, to disguise your racism. And what they really want is, systems and structures that promote oppression to be destroyed and dismantled so that there can be no one class that has power over the others, whether it's a racial group, a gender, a sexual group, a religious group. So they have a totally different view of the social world, and that's reflected in everything they do.
I think one thing to keep in mind, too, is that we remember that Dr. King really had this sense that the lives of black folks and white folks were bound together, bound up together, and that the success of one was not to be without the success of the other, and that we were going to have to learn how to truly, genuinely get along and have a sharing of power. And while there is some of those voices in critical social theory, and at times, Shane, I'm employing critical race theory in some of my scholarship in the secular academy. And so it's important to realize that there are segments of critical social theory that is about the sharing of power. However, the ideology itself is not so much about that. It is more about a transfer of power and a taking of power from certain constituencies and giving that power to those who have been historically marginalized and disenfranchised. Remember, critical social theory has its own agenda, its own goals, its own commitments, its own beliefs, its own ideological perspective. And so how it's thinking about power, who has it and who should be problematized, and then who doesn't and who should be given it and how it should be given, is in keeping with those commitments and goals and those ideological perspectives. And at the heart of Dr. King is something different than that. And that really comes out. And we quote Dr. King in our book, and we point, our readers to some very wonderful resources that show his speeches and his perspectives. And it is a campaign. And again, it's that civil rights campaign that is kind of traditionally understood in our culture that is somewhat under attack by critical social theory.
I want to portray people charitably. I want to say what they think they're saying and not what, straw man them, not misrepresent them. But it almost looks as if when we contrast the civil rights vision with the critical theory vision, as if that end goal they're moving toward is really just perpetuating conflict forever. Like there actually is no end goal of peace, harmony, restoration, or justice in any sense we would have historically recognized, right? Like it's furthering divisions between people and perpetuating ever more minute sort of conflicts, power conflicts, so that the industry itself can perpetuate. And this is something that Douglas Murray, I remember, pointed out in The Madness of Crowds, which I thought was so helpful, that as historical progress is made on the civil rights front, or the sexual rights front, or the gender front, whatever it is, not endorsing any particular claim of those movements, but we have made progress toward their goals, their stated goals. As that progress is made, their rhetoric heats up. It doesn't de-escalate, it escalates as if things are worse than ever. And that's the kind of tenor of these movements. Like things are worse now than ever before. And I remember when, after the George Floyd incident, it was like there was this sense that was never fully justified, but the sense was that this is the worst it's ever been. We are living through the darkest days of racial conflict in America right now. And that, as terrible as the killing of one man is, an unjust killing of a man, it's statistically untenable to act like we're in the darkest days for civil rights in the United States. We just aren't. What's the source of that intensifying rhetoric? And am I being unfair as I characterize this as a drive to like perpetuate conflict?
So this is why it's so important to understand their overall worldview. So they would say, in their defense, they would say, we're not creating conflict, we're calling attention to conflict that's already there, that's been hidden. So when you say, no, you're creating new divisions, they would say, no, we're showing you these divisions that exist that you're blind to because you're a straight white male. And so, and then why do they do that? Because implicit in their entire outlook on reality is the idea that the ruling class, whether it's whites or men or heterosexuals or Christians, the ruling class imposes their values on all of society in a way that appears normal and fair and just and natural. That's how the ruling class oppresses everyone else, by convincing you and me and everybody that we're actually living in a just society. So when we make supposedly progress towards an actual just society, they will say, oh, you think that's happening, but really it's a way for white people or for men or for heterosexuals to disguise their new mechanisms of oppression. And actually, we quote numerous critical social theorists like Eduardo Bonilla Silva, who say things like racism never goes away, it just adapts, and that today, the racial mechanisms for suppressing blacks and oppressing people of color are just as effective as those during Jim Crow. He actually says that in his book, Racism Without Racists. So this is a line that goes throughout critical theorists' writings, that we really can't make progress or any progress that's there. It's one step forward, two steps back, and racism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, all of these things merely go underground and become it's more harder and more insidious to get rid of.
Do the roots that this school of ideas, this group of ideas, have in Marxism have anything to do with this tendency? And maybe that's a really open-ended question, or like a no-duh question, but I actually really do want to know, because I think there's an assumption many folks who've heard the term cultural Marxism will have that, well, Marxism was about ushering in this revolution by the proletariat and overthrow the bourgeoisie and reform society and usher in a new and more just and equal type of society. Like, that's classical Marxism. We do this along economic lines. Well, race just got subbed in for economics, and we're off to the races. Is that what's going on? Is it more complicated than that? What do you think of that characterization of the story?
Well, we would say it is accurate to think of historic critical theory, capital C, capital T, that originated in the Frankfurt School, a school of social science and institute in Frankfurt, Germany in the 1920s and 30s. The theorists that were part of that school, their whole campaign was both an extension and an amendment to Marxism. And so Karl Marx is really the first critical theorist. That's a good way to think about him. And the Frankfurt School had amended and extended Marxism, critical social theory that we see today, that encompasses many critical social theories like critical pedagogy, critical race theory, queer theory, feminist theory, postcolonialism. These critical social theories, under the umbrella of critical social theory, these theories are both an extension and an amendment to historic critical theory. And so that means that at the root of critical social theory is also Marxism. But it is important, Shane, to keep in mind that it is too truncated and not nearly nuanced enough and not entirely accurate to just sub critical social theory from Marxism. And this is partly why we are not keen on the term cultural Marxism as some kind of big bucket to throw everything in. And our book takes great pains to be nuanced. But it would be false to say that there's no relationship between Marxism and where we are today in terms of critical social theory. And the woke ideology that we see on the ground, in the streets, in the break rooms, at the coffee shop, that is downstream from critical social theory. And so the woke ideas, some that are permeating our culture, are not necessarily connected to critical social theory very directly. In fact, sometimes they're even against critical social theory. But a lot of these ideas do find some fountain, some head, so to speak, some fountainhead upstream in terms of critical social theory. And Marxism is something that is not ultimately or ever entirely stamped out when we're thinking about these ideas.
Well, if we go fully upstream, all the way to the origin of Marxism itself, one of the more provocative claims that Tom Holland makes in his book Dominion is that Marxism itself is sort of a sublimation of Christian instincts, that the desire to lift up the oppressed and the weak and exalt them over the proud and the powerful and the rich is something that a moral instinct or intuition that Marx is taking from Christianity and making the master instinct or the master moral that then controls politics and ethics from that point on. Is there something Christian at the root of critical theory, or something that's twisted from Christianity? And how should that change or shape the way that we approach it as Christians?
I definitely think there is. And in our second to last or third to last chapter, we talk about why is wokeness, why is critical social theory so attractive to so many people? And we give many different reasons, but one that we press on is the idea that it fulfills a spiritual need. So human beings, from a Christian perspective, our deepest need at the core level of our being is the need to feel righteous. Like Adam and Eve, when they found themselves to be naked and ashamed, they covered themselves. And Paul talks about how when we didn't know God's righteousness, we made a righteousness of our own. Well, in wokeness, we see a way for people to make their own righteousness. They can be on the right side of history. They can look down on the bigots. They can feel good about themselves. If they tweet the right tweets, if they post the right posts, if they vote for the right politicians, they can be cleansed. They can be good. They can be righteous. And we point out that that really is an explicit contrast. It's a perversion of the gospel. The gospel says you are fallen, you are broken, you are rebels and sinful and stained and dirty. And the way to then become clean is through trusting in someone else. Whereas critical social theory today says, yes, you are dirty and unclean and bad, but you can solve your own problem. You can cleanse yourself. You can wash out the damned spot if you try hard enough. You can be an ally. You can be safe. You can be on the right side of history. I do think we actually lay this out in a figure I had my friend Michael draw, but it just shows that if you compare, creation, fall, redemption, restoration, that's a Christian story. You can actually write a parallel story where there's no creation, but there is a fall. You fall into whiteness, into patriarchy, into homophobia. And then instead of redemption, you have activism, you become an ally, you divest yourself from privilege, you repent of your whiteness. Then the end goal is diversity, equity, inclusion. It's the promised land. So it really does run in parallel, but this is why it's so dangerous, because people that are empathetic, that are genuinely seeking to do what's right, they find this is a way to feel good about themselves and look down on others, rather than embracing the forgiveness that God offers us in Christ.
Yeah, so the two interesting observations that spring off of that, and we're a little bit far afield at this point, but I think this stuff is super fascinating, and I love y'all's insights into it, are that number one, this is a sort of Christianity without the gospel. So in other words, you just have a law. It's a bizarre, twisted ideological form of the law, but it's still a law, and you obtain righteousness by obeying the law. But the old trouble with the law still applies. It's that we can't fulfill it, even if we remake it along a critical social theory line. And so we're plagued by perpetual guilt because we can never fulfill the demands of this unrighteous law that we've substituted for God's righteous law. And then the second problem, and Holland also points this out, and I think this is particularly scary, is that when you have Christianity without Christ, without the theology of the cross, what you end up with is an invitation for paganism to essentially come back, for forms of what we would look at it and say, those are racism, those are various forms of supremacy, ethnic supremacy. Those things can then come back. And in the face of all the social justice warriors who go, that's racist, you're seeking power, you just want to perpetuate the influence of people who look like you, that person says, yes, exactly. It's kind of the yes Chad meme. What of it? What of it? And at that point, as he points out, the social justice warrior has nothing to say in response because they're assuming the goodness of their cause. The moment they meet someone who doesn't assume the goodness of their cause, they're in big trouble. So what do you think of those two sort of observations? Because to me, I could see how you could accuse that of being overly simplistic, but it does unlock a lot for me.
No, there is certainly, as Shane, some connection there. if everybody adopts ethnic identity and ethnic pride, if everybody does that, if every different ethnicity does that, well, that's not going to bring us together. There's a sense in which we're going to be more and more polarized. And critical social theory pushes for a hyper connection and community and solidarity around these demographic intersectional markers that if everybody began to approach their personal lives with those kinds of and that same intensity and goals in terms of wrapping their identity in, for instance, their ethnicity, well, then that is not going to create more cohesiveness in our society. It's going to do the opposite.
I'm talking today with Neil Shenvi and Pat Sawyer, authors of Critical Dilemma, The Rise of Critical Theories and Social Justice Ideology, Implications for the Church and Society. We're going to take a quick break. We'll be right back. Stay with us. What exactly is gender? In our age of widespread confusion, the Christian worldview offers clarity and a vision for gender that's true, good, and beautiful. That's the topic of the next Lighthouse Voices event on October 3rd at 7 p.m. Eastern. Our featured speaker is Dr. Abigail Favale, author of The Genesis of Gender. Dr. Favale will provide a Christian perspective on gender rooted in Scripture and examine how this view compares and clashes with secular views of gender. You can attend in person at the Focus on the Family bookstore in Holland, Michigan, or online via live stream. Claim your spot today at colsoncenter.org/Lighthouse Voices. That's colsoncenter.org/Lighthouse Voices. We're back on Upstream talking with Neil Shenvi and Pat Sawyer about their book, Critical Dilemma, and how a set of ideologies change the way the world talks about justice and how Christians can cut through the confusion. Neil, Pat, I want to zoom in on this particular chapter, and this is the one that really caught my attention, and my producer was really enthusiastic about it too. And that is the chapter on what critical theories potentially get right. Chapter 7 in the book. Now, I think Christians, you rightly point out, are prone to hear the vocabulary of critical social theories. Conservative Christians, right, on the right, evangelicals, people listening to this podcast are prone to hear the vocabulary, and I think rightly they have a reflex to dismiss a lot of this stuff. It's just a gag reflex, right? As Rosaria Butterfield says, you don't have to understand everything in the ideological woke sphere to know that it's garbage and it belongs in the garbage. So you don't have to give a coherent explanation for everything, but there's some good things. There are true things that the woke movement, if you want to put it that way, claims about race and ethnicity and sexuality, and even sometimes things like embodied gender. So first of all, tell me what it was that prompted you to write this chapter, because it does seem like a cautionary step back or a punch pulled from the full force of the overall project. What was the idea behind it?
We actually had to begin with an apologia, basically saying, hey, why are we even including this chapter? Because don't you want to just tear this to the ground and just burn it to the ground and be done with it? And there's two answers we give. One is that it's actually true. It's abused, but it's actually true that all truth is God's truth. If anything is actually true, it's true because it reflects God's reality. And so to deny the truth, and to the extent you deny the truth, you're living in a fantasy world. So as Christians, we have to be able to affirm anything that's true, whoever says it. Just because your political opponent says something, you can't just immediately say, well, that's not true. I don't believe you because you're my opponent. That's a foolish way to view the world. But more importantly, actually, we argue that if you're going to mount a credible argument against critical social theory, like we do throughout the book, you have to be informed about it, and you have to be able to appreciate why it's so attractive. Because if critical theorists said nothing at all that was even remotely true, people would pretty much just ignore them. The fact that they mix their poison with elements of truth is why it's so potent and deadly. So the key to mounting a defense against critical social theory in our culture and in the church is to acknowledge what they're getting right, and then to say, hey, but even though they do get things right, they're in the main and foundationally dead wrong. So that's why we have a whole chapter. We have a whole chapter legitimately saying here's some issues that they do actually get right.
So the reason I opened with the Dr. King quote from the I Have a Dream speech is that I myself, and I think many conservative Christians, for a certain phase of our lives in our engagement with this critical theory ideology that's coming at us, responded with this counter instinct to say, well, we should just be colorblind, right? We should judge everyone by just the content of their character and not the color of their skin. And those are words that appear in the speech, right? That you alluded to a second ago, I think it was Pat, how these words can actually be twisted and misconstrued and actually taken as a check that you can't really cash. I mean, they're taken in a sense that Dr. King didn't mean them necessarily. And that is that race just doesn't exist. It's a thing that we don't need to take into account, or similar categories don't exist, or things that we don't need to take into account, or the historical injustices that have happened in this country don't need to influence how the groups relate to each other in today's world. So the first thing that you think critical social theories potentially get right, the first truth, is that race is a social construct. Now, there's two sides to this one. So explain what's going on there, because I think most people listening to this would say, yeah, race is a social construct, but it's important to understand what we mean by that.
Well, what we do mean is that race is not rooted in biological categories. It has been socially constructed by society. So there's a sense in which race is not real, but we want to keep in mind that race has real effects. And just because race is a social construct and not rooted in biological reality, that doesn't mean that the effects of race are not pronounced and are not significant. You mentioned about colorblind perspective. Dr. King wanted himself and the Black community to be seen. And sometimes colorblind ideology can erase Black people and Black contributions, Black innovation, and so forth. And we don't want the language of race being a social construct to then mean that we're not going to deal with the effects and the issues that have been brought about by our racialized history, particularly in the U.S. We need to be sensitive to these dynamics. And one of the positives that critical social theory reminds us of is our racialized history. It helps us as a nation to deal honestly with our racialized history. And then another positive connected to that is that even though there have been major changes in civil rights legislature and civil rights efforts, we still have lingering effects of slavery and 350 years of slavery since slavery began really in this country in terms of slaves coming in this country in the 1520s. And then we have an additional 100 years of Black Code and Black Jim Crow laws. So critical social theory, a positive of it, reminds us of this racialized history and then helps us think about, well, what are the lingering effects today in 2023? What are the lingering effects of this racialized history, and how are people of color being impacted today because of this history? So critical social theory reminds us of that, and those are two of the several positives that we mentioned.
To pick up myself here, I'll refer back to prior version of Shane in 2008 after Barack Obama won his first bid for the presidency. And I remember parroting this line at that point that I was hearing on talk radio, which was that, okay, we've elected a Black president. Racism is over. We can stop talking about race, right? That famous Morgan Freeman clip that you refer to. It's Chris Wallace, I think who was interviewing him.
Mike Wallace.
Mike Wallace, not Chris. Okay, yeah. wrong Wallace was interviewing him, and Morgan Freeman essentially says, "Well, stop talking about race, and then it'll go away. The racism thing will go away." And it's fun because it's from Morgan Freeman, and that just sort of lends authority to it all on its own because he sounds so great. But the sentiment there exactly expressed my reaction at that point. I think the reaction of a lot of people, which is like, we can move past this now. We live in a post-racial society. But you think one of the valid insights of critical social theories is that we do not live in a post-racial society. Could you justify that for us?
Yeah, and we cite in our book just numerous studies, scientific studies that are well-controlled, well-designed, that just show you that racial discrimination does indeed happen today in the real world. Through job discrimination, through hate crimes, it actually happens. Now, it's not solely falling on Blacks or on Hispanics or Asians. There are also anti-white hate crimes. There are other, and in certain contexts, you can be penalized for being white or for being Asian. That can happen too. We're not saying it's all one-sided, but we're saying if you look at the data, there's plenty of evidence that we don't live in this post-racial paradise. We just don't. We do think, both of us think, that critical race theorists tend to misinterpret and exaggerate the extent to which race still conditions social outcomes. But it is there. And so one of the important things that we can do as Christians is not to pretend like these things don't exist. And we're not citing Ibram X. Kendi. We're not citing these radical scholars. We're citing science articles, nature articles that say, hey, we did studies. And yeah, you can measure that, say, the average white job applicant, it's 35% more interview callbacks than the same qualified Black applicant over the last 4 decades. It hasn't really changed. And so that has to condition how, say, a white person approaches the issue of race and saying, hey, you might say, well, that's just, unconscious bias. No one's out to get you. It's not overt hatred. And we agree. But if you are that Black candidate, it does not affect how you feel about getting turned down for yet another job. You do have to ask yourself, is this because people are just unconsciously biased against me? Even if I give them the benefit of the doubt and say it's not intentional, but it does affect your life. And so that's one way that Christians can realize that, okay, well, there is something actually there that's not just the pure speculative interpretations of critical race theorists.
And along this topic, Shane, part of my secular scholarship is pushing back and strongly challenging white power groups, white nationalist groups. So this means I've spent some time studying current white power groups and studies related to how people not part of white power groups feel about some of the perspectives that white power groups push. And it's surprising still to me the percentage of regular people, quote unquote, that still are given to some racist perspective in 2023. So this idea that we're a post-racist society is certainly not the case. And while our book is certainly net critical of critical social theory, our book is a strong critique. At its foundation, critical social theory is incompatible with biblical Christianity, and we make this case. We do bring out these positives because we are trying to win people more than we're trying to win an argument. And so we have to be fair and honest about the knowledge area, and we need to applaud loudly the things that it gets right. And it's also insightful in certain ways that people will begin to recognize that, wow, this emphasis on cultural capital, for instance, that critical social theory talks about, really is helpful for me to think about how power is manifested in society. And those topics are not necessarily being talked about from other knowledge areas. We think our readers will find this refreshing and encouraging, that we have tried to take pains to deal honestly with things and not just have a tribal screed that we've put forth.
Now, how would you differentiate what you just said from a perspective that I've heard sharply criticized, and I believe you two are critical of it as well, which is that Christians can use critical theories as a tool, or critical social theory, rather, as a tool to help uncover injustice and then address it more accurately. Would you agree with that perspective? And if not, then how do you differentiate it from what you're doing as sort of admit the things that it gets right?
I mean, I would say that critical theory, broadly speaking, doesn't intend to be just a tool. It intends to be a much broader enterprise that speaks about things like identity. What is identity? Who are human beings? What is justice? What is morality? What is oppression? It answers these big questions, and it analyzes all axes of our identity, whether it's race, class, gender, sexuality, physical ability, religion. It answers questions of how do you know the truth? So when you look at that, the big picture of what critical social theory does, it is not just a tool. And moreover, you can't adopt just one part of it. One of the things we bring out in our chapters on critical race theory, is that the earliest critical race theorists, going back to Derek Bell, Kimberly Crenshaw, 1989, 1993, at the very outset, they said very clearly that a defining element of critical race theory is that it treats issues of racism, classism, and heterosexism as equal forms of oppression that must be equally dismantled simultaneously. So they will not allow you to compartmentalize critical race theory and apply it only to race and say, well, we're not going to apply these ideas to, say, gender or sexuality. They will say, time out, you can't do that. It's in our defining elements. So we're critical in the sense that on its own terms, it wants to, like Pat's phrase is, it wants to colonize more and more of your mental landscape. Its tentacles will reach into every single thought and take it captive. And as Christians, we have to say, no, you can't do that. We don't want that to happen. So what we're saying is we have to put it this way. Critical social theorists say true things. Critical social theorists have true insights occasionally. Whereas critical social theory as this work of scholarship, this ideology, that is fundamentally incompatible with Christianity for many, many reasons.
Shane, I was just going to say real quickly that when Neil is saying that critical social theory, you can't just approach it as a tool. We obviously recognize that people can work against the knowledge area in their attempts to use parts of it to make a certain kind of point. We're not superstitious. We recognize that people can pick a certain critical social theory apart and leave 70% of it to the side and maybe use 20 to 30% of it. Even in my work, I will do some of that. But to Neil's strong point is that this is an approach that is against the knowledge area itself. The knowledge area disallows this compartmentalization of and bifurcation of certain ideas that you use, but then you jettison others or you strongly disagree with others. From the critical social theory mindset, this is disallowed. And then in addition to that, the more one begins to onboard these ideas, as Neil already mentioned, the knowledge area itself will seek to take on more and more in your thinking. And ideas have consequences. We're commanded, 2 Corinthians 10:5, to take every thought captive for a reason. So the idea that one can just play with these ideas and stay totally insulated from being affected in their embracing of these ideas without qualification, that's a myth. And we see more and more people that are being affected by these ideas, affecting their whole worldview and how they think about life as a whole. And so this idea that you'll just cut it off and have some kind of cozy relationship with these parts of these ideas is just not something that tends to take place. And again, we're not trying to be alarmist. We're just trying to represent the ideas as they actually are.
Well, this is why a chapter like this is so critical for making your overall argument against critical social theories and their use in especially the church, because it doesn't weaken your argument to admit what the opponent gets right. It actually strengthens it because it takes away their ability to equivocate. And I think this is really key as we talk about this subject. There's an example you use, kind of an illustration from like medieval city design or fortress design, right? It's the Motte and Bailey. And anyone who's ever been in a speech and debate league will know exactly what this means. But for those who don't know what it means, could you kind of explain what a Motte and Bailey is and how it plays a central role in the perpetuation of critical social theories?
So the term Motte and Bailey, I think, originated with a philosopher named Nicholas Shackle. He was talking about postmodern scholarship, and he said that in their papers they employ something he called a Motte and Bailey approach to argument. So the idea is in a medieval castle, Motte and Bailey had a design where you had this really broad, low-lying bailey, which is where people lived on a daily basis. And it was hard to defend. It was big, not really great walls. So when it was attacked, it would easily be taken. What they could do is all the people who lived in the bailey could retreat to a smaller area called the motte, which is on a raised ground, had big walls, was easy to defend. So you'd live in the bailey, but then when there was under attack, you'd retreat to the much more defensible motte. And he said this is what postmodern scholars do because they'll make outrageous claims that are just absolute nonsense. Like there is no truth. There is no truth. That's their bailey. Then when you say, wait a minute, is that statement true? Because that makes no sense. Is that statement, because if that statement's true, then it can't be true because there's no truth. So that's their Bailey claim. When you press them on their crazy claim, they retreat tactically to the defensible motte. They say, oh, I didn't mean that. All I mean is that truth is constructed through social processes and it can be hard to discern and it's complicated. So that's what I meant when I said there is no truth. Then you say, oh, okay, well, never mind. Then once you've left, you've repelled the attack, they go right back to saying there is no truth. So we see this all the time among critical social theorists. Well, they'll make some crazy claim, like, for example, racism today is just as bad as it has always been since the days of chattel slavery. And they'll say that over and over and over. When you ask them, wait a minute, do you really mean to say? They say, oh, no. All we're saying is that the racial structure of society is still structured to benefit whites and to disadvantage people of color on average. You'll say, well, that was a different claim. They'll say, no, that's all I meant. So you have to spot that fallacy, that technique, spot when it's happening and point out, no, those claims are actually extremely different. I will not let you retreat from your radical claim, your crazy claim, to a safer, defensible claim. You can't do that.
That's very important, particularly in an example like the one you just cited, or the one that you use in the book, which is that all white people are racist. That's the Bailey claim, right? And I think a lot of people hear that and they rightly bristle because, well, racism in this country in particular carries some really unsavory connotations, that things that most people would never be okay with now. I mean, that just revolting moral atrocities. And then that's what we hear. But then when I say, well, I'm not pro-slavery. I'm not pro-Jim Crow. I want to treat my black neighbors equally. I want to be, good to people. I just don't think that some of your claims are true about in your ideology. Well, they'll retreat back to what was the Mott claim, the more defensible claim. It was like, on average, there's still, systemic things that disadvantage people of color or something like that. And it was like, well, of course, you have just demonstrated that in this conversation already, but that's a very different claim from all white people are racist. And we have to point out the difference because that's the whole game with equivocation. Along those lines, I think this is important to say because in a discussion like this, we tend to get defensive, right? Both sides will get defensive in a discussion like this, whether we're, an advocate of critical theories or we're skeptical of them and don't like them, whether we're black, whether we're white, whether we're Asian, whatever. There's a defensive reaction, right? That's going to happen. And I think an important part of overcoming that is, number one, admitting a lot of these truths. And then number two, just recognizing that equivocation that's happening, right? Because I have so many friends, Neil, Pat, who will hear a claim like, you're racist because you're white, right? And there is this like visceral defensiveness that rises up in them, rightly so, because they've never done anything to warrant that kind of accusation. And that's fine. The problem is that can lead you to overshoot the target. It can lead you to dismiss true things. And if you get caught being the one to dismiss true things, then you look bad. You look like you're the one in denial of reality. You lose the argument, even though you weren't the one who equivocated or, retreated to that completely separate argument. So this tactic is really important to point out. I just want to say that. Okay, so we got a few minutes here, and there are several more claims that you deal with in the true category, true with an asterisk, right? And one of those is that, switching over to the issue of sex and gender, that some aspects of gender expression are socially constructed. So I think a conservative Christian could rightly hear that statement and think, oh boy, here comes the trans ideology, and this is going to be sold under the same premises that a lot of the race stuff was sold to me. What's wrong with that reaction? What's true about the statement?
I mean, we have examples in the book of, obvious things like the color blue being associated with men in our culture and the color pink being associated with girls in our culture. That's a social convention that we have, and there's nothing wrong about it, but it's just not, objectively, absolutely, theologically true that, certain colors are reserved for certain genders. That's not the case. You go back 100, 200 years, you'll see men wearing pink smocks in medieval France. That was because in that culture, that was what they did. Or this is a great one. I didn't realize this until I researched the book, but until about the early 20th century, little boys wore dresses until the age of around 6. And there's a ceremony called breeching when they'd receive their first pair of pants. You can actually find on the internet a picture of FDR at age 6 with long golden curls in a dress. Now, it was not because they were gender bending. That was just culturally what Americans did 100 years ago. Our only point is, now we're not saying therefore that today, that therefore a 34-year-old man can walk around in a dress. We're not saying that. We're just pointing out that even queer theorists and feminists were right to point out that some elements of gender expression are culturally conditioned and socially constructed. What we're not saying is that all of them are socially constructed, nor are we saying it's fine then to do gender bending and just to flout society's conventions, because as we make the point we make in the book is that every culture is a way to express your gender, to say, I am delighted with the way God's created me to be, and I revel in it. It's a good thing. And so every culture, whether you're in Russia or in the Middle East or in the US, we should find the ways that our culture designates to express our gender and then show people that, yes, as Christians, we rejoice in God's creation of me and my body, and I will acknowledge that in how I dress and how I present myself, things like that.
And if you double down and triple down that nothing is connected to gender is socially constructed, well, then when you're exposed that that's just not the case, now you've opened the door for the queer theorist to go ahead and say, and now let's continue. And biological sex is also socially constructed. And don't double and triple down on that because you see how you were wrong about what you were saying earlier. And we're trying to be nuanced enough and acknowledge truth where it is true relative to the social construction of how gender might be expressed. So therefore, now we have the credibility to hold the line and reject notions, for instance, that biological sex, for instance, is socially constructed. It actually strengthens our position of our critique.
Draw a lot of this together for us, because we opened with the dominant issue when we talk about critical social theory is race, right? That is kind of the issue. It's the beginning of the whole process of recognizing historical injustices and trying to correct them. But this template has gotten applied to other things. What happened there? And how can Christians who look at race on the one hand and go, yes, there are legitimate injustices that need to be acknowledged and corrected, both individually and corporately here, but that doesn't translate over into therefore gay marriage or therefore transgenderism? Like, what's the barrier there that we're missing that can help us identify that jump from truth in one respect to serious error in another respect?
I think it's a very complicated question because in our culture, yes, race is the foot in the door for critical social theory in the US today, but in other cultures, it's other issues. So I've heard from people in India, it's caste over there. In Africa, it's colonialism. So that is their foot in the door to all of these other issues like sexuality and gender. But I would actually trace the fundamental, if I could pick one issue, it comes down to what you define as oppression. So critical social theory, from its inception, really has understood oppression to mean any time a dominant social category imposes their views on culture in a way that seems natural and objective. And when you talk about oppression in our culture, that definition is almost just universal today. When you say someone's an oppressed group, you don't mean they're actually being chained up and beaten every day. You mean that they're part of a group that is having values imposed on that group. That's what you mean typically in a culture. Well, that view is just wrong because some norms and values are actually God ordained. Things like the gender binary. No one's being oppressed by the gender binary. That is simply God's way that he created the universe. So if you have to trace all of these issues back to, say, one concept, it's how the term oppression has become redefined in the 60s by the New Left to cohere with a critical theorist understanding of reality. So we have to go back and say that definition is fundamentally wrong because we live in God's universe and he defines what good and right and true and justice are, and then work from there to say, well, no, what is actually oppression and what is actually a reflection of God's created order?
Christians encounter this demand, I think, and as we wrap the discussion together, this is, I think, very important to acknowledge. We encounter this demand that we accept all these categories and this vocabulary, and that we listen, and that we sort of acknowledge things out of the gate, even things that we haven't had clearly explained to us. And I want to acknowledge that sense of confusion that many people will feel upon encountering this stuff as it escapes the academic departments where it was created, the laboratories. But it seems like this will always put us on the defensive. And so that posture, that it's not enough, that reactive posture isn't enough. How can we be offensive, switch to a right foot forward stance and be ready and proactive to adjudicate these claims? Because I think that defensive posture just kind of sets you up to lose. It sets you up to be morally humiliated in every discussion. How can we set ourselves up to come out morally vindicated without becoming experts like you guys have?
Shane, I think that's a great point. And you're getting at this concept, which is that any time we're being introduced to words or phrases or ideas that we've never heard of before or we don't understand hardly at all, we get intimidated. That's kind of a natural reaction. And critical social theory is full of words and phrases and ideas that seem to be a little bit obscurant, that are impenetrable. Now, it's a facade in a way because we can all learn things, okay? And our book is designed to help people get their minds wrapped around these knowledge areas. And in doing that, that learning about various concepts and perspectives that we unpack, and we do this not only with jargon from the scholarship, because that's needed and important, but we also give example after example and analogies and so forth to try to make it more palatable and more accessible to people who aren't normally engaging these ideas. And once that knowledge begins to build, then that intimidation factor starts to drop, and then we can emotionally come off and get rid of and jettison a defensive posture. And then we can begin to move forward in terms of some offensive critiques. In addition to the offensive critiques of the knowledge areas, our book also puts forward a plan, if you will, ways forward for unity and connection and healing. And so we're not just critiquing these knowledge areas and saying, hey, this is a problem. We're also offering our readers, well, here's some action steps forward to try to redress and remedy our separation in our society, our fracture in our society. And when you begin to offer a positive vision of racial connection or connection across difference, period, now you're not only on the offensive, but you're doing it in a way that is disarming. That you're not just trying to bang a hammer against the bad ideas. You're putting forth a solid, wonderful, even beautiful vision for connection and unity that does not rely on critical social theory. That's the thing. We don't have to use critical social theory to get to a much better place in society in terms of connection. So hopefully that will help get our reader off this defensive posture.
My guests today have been Neil Shenvi and Pat Sawyer, authors of Critical Dilemma, The Rise of Critical Theories and Social Justice Ideology, Implications for the Church and Society. Neil, Pat, I always think it's such a beautiful thing when somebody who has extensive training in one area academically develops a fiery interest in something that's not quite the same subject and just goes for it. And it seems like that's what you two have really done on this issue and all the related issues over the last few years. So thank you for your work, for your passion, for your interest, and just filling a desperate need to equip Christians to think well and carefully and just non-anxiously on this topic. It's a real contribution.
Thank you, Shane.
Thank you, Shane.
Upstream is a program of the Colson Center. When it comes to the hardest questions we ask, we have thousands of years of accumulated wisdom from which to draw, from a faith that is the explanation of all reality. So come upstream and learn to understand the world, the church, and the God who has placed you in them. Be sure to rate the podcast and subscribe in your listening app. You can also connect with us on social media or by visiting upstream.colsoncenter.org.